Okay, let's get back into the Men Behind the KJV. I had 5 messages to do here in my notes, and so this is the 4th one, so we were able to cut one of these out by combining some of them. We're into our last group. We've done Westminster, Oxford, we're into Cambridge. We've done the first of those. So we've done 5 groups at 2.5 places. Now we'll finish out the Cambridge group tonight by looking at the Apocrypha section. We finished the Old Testament section. None of those men were very outstanding. We have more information on Edward Lively and Lawrence Chatterton than we had on most of the others, but none of them are very outstanding. We have to go back to our earlier groups to find our really outstanding men. So far, Lancelot Andrewes, John Reynolds, and Miles Smith. And that's an appropriate comment because number 1 of our Apocrypha group, John Boyce, will fit right in with those 3 men if we want to rank the top 4 men who worked on the KJV as far as their importance is concerned. Then we would throw John Boyce in there as well. His name is spelled 2 different ways, B-O-I-S, and then it's probably been brought up to contemporary spelling by spelling it B-O-Y-S. So I have both ways, but I think the B-O-I-S is probably the more original of the 2. John Boyce, he was born in 1560. He died in 1643. He lived to be old, 83, and he was 44 at the time of the beginning of the preliminary stages of the translation. 44. He was a doctor and fellow at St. John's College. He's really the only man of the whole Cambridge group. That includes the Old Testament and the Apocrypha sections of the Cambridge group. He's really the only man from the whole Cambridge group that stands out as a luminary. I would rank him with Andrews, Reynolds, and Smith as being one of the foremost, and I would rank him 4 also of the men who worked on the KJV. As we have listed them before, they would go something like this. John Reynolds, Miles Smith, Lancelot Andrewes, and then number 4, our current man, John Boyce. Or you could reverse these, which I think is what I've said before. It's hard to know which of those men we would rank first. My guess would be Miles Smith because he was final editor. That's the way they came to my mind, though. John Reynolds, Miles Smith, Lancelot Andrewes, John Boyce are the 4 most important men. And again, if you don't remember any of the other men, and you can't remember these 4, then Reynolds and Smith are the 2 important ones. R-S-S-R, however you remember it, those are the 2 important men. But Boyce is very important because he's going to have a hand on the final committee, not a final editor, as were both Smith and Bilson, but on the final committee of either the 6 or the 12 men, 1 or 2 from each of the 6 groups divided up into 3 different locations. As a boy, he was very precocious. He was fluent in Hebrew by the age of 5. He was an early friend of John Overall. That takes us back to our very first group, the Westminster Old Testament Committee. To show you something of his study habits, he was known as a bookworm, and so many of these men were, but some were more ecclesiastical leaders than academicians, and I think Boyce would probably fit it more as an academician than an ecclesiastical leader. As a Cambridge undergraduate, he went to the library at 4 a.m. each day, and he left at 8 p.m. That's how much time each day he spent studying. 16 hours a day, sitting at his desk as an undergraduate at Cambridge. Now, just before being appointed a fellow at St. John's College, He had thought about going into medicine, and he actually studied in this area somewhat. He was already somewhat, well, more than somewhat proficient in biblical matters and biblical studies. But he did consider the matter of becoming a medical doctor and going into medicine, and he began that journey by studying medicine. But it seemed that every disease he studied, he contracted as soon as he finished studying the disease, which was literally true in his life. So he deduced that the study of medicine produced hypochondria in a person, and he decided to give up the study of medicine. You know what hypochondria means? I think we use the word for many different things. Someone that's easily afraid or quickly afraid about something, unnecessarily afraid. But it's really a person who experiences emotional stress and mindful stress because of supposed physical ailments. Doesn't really have the ailment, but it appears as though he has the ailment, and the person suffers mental stress as a result. Now, whether he really got the disease or it was psychosomatic, it was in his mind, I don't know. But he deduced that every time he studied a disease, any new disease that he began to work on in his studies in medicine, he contracted that disease. So he deduced that it produced hypochondria, and he thought it would be best to give up the study of medicine, which he did. And I guess we're grateful for that, because he was of more benefit to the church as a scholar than as a medical doctor. But at other times, he was a very robust soul. He frequently walked to his mother's for dinner on the weekends. And you say, well, what's the big deal about walking to his mother's for dinner? Well, his mother lived 20 miles away. So he was a fairly robust soul. He was a hypochondriac as long as he studied medicine. Once he got out of that, I guess his strength returned to him. But he often walked to his mother. That's 20 miles one way. This would be on Saturday evening, 20 miles one way. He walked to his mother's for dinner. You'd be ready for dinner, breakfast, and lunch by the time you got there after 20 miles, and the same at your house when you returned that evening. And he would carry a book with him, obviously. He wasn't going to not waste 20 miles worth of walking. He would carry a book with him and try to master it by the time he got there and returned. He was the one who made wise use of his time. I know I've often done something similar to that, especially in my earlier days when I didn't have the time to study that I do now. Now I've got so much time that I don't have to be looking for time to study. But when I was working 9 or 10 hours a day and I just didn't have enough time, I frequently took a book to work and read it to and from work. And that was while I was in the car driving. We had a steering wheel that was manufactured in such a way it was a nice little crotch to place a book in. Sometimes the Bible and sometimes other books. I couldn't mark while I drove, but I could read. If you're a good reader, you can do that. You glance down and glance up. Of course, I didn't have many people that wanted to ride with me, but I enjoyed reading anyway. You probably would not have wanted to. This was a little safer for him. He walked. On occasions, he took a horse to his mother's house, and he even translated some of the Bible as he was riding on a horse. So when the horse went up, his pen went up. When the horse came down, his pen came down. Hence the bad punctuation in the KJV. Commas where there should be periods, and periods where there should be commas. Well, there is an old story. My Bible in its notes in the back even contains that story, not concerning Boyce, but another scholar, that much of the Bible actually was done, at least the punctuation was actually placed in while a man was riding on horseback. That's kind of an old legend, and maybe it was, it came about as a result of someone's exasperation over the punctuation of the KJV, which we will discuss in detail later. But be that as it may, it seems to have some merit to it. So he was a man who made wise use of his time, whether walking to his mother's or riding on the horse to his mother's. He either translated the Bible, which would mean you'd almost have to be using both hands with two sets of books before you, your exemplar and what you're actually copying. You'd have to have some manuscript before you or something before you from which you were going to make your translation and make that in addition. He married at age 36 and had 4 sons and 2 daughters. So he is, again, one of the few married. It may sound like a lot of them are married, but the only reason it sounds that way is because I keep pointing out who's married. I didn't point out all the ones who are not married. The vast majority of them were not married. But he was one midway through life, or really just part of the way through his life, because he lived to be 83, who decided to get married. And he did at the age of 36, having 4 sons and 2 daughters. Now, because he was such a bookworm and his wife was such a poor money manager, they often fell into great debt. And he, like his earlier friend John Overall, had to sell his library on a couple of occasions just to get out of debt. Overall had to sell his library to provide for his children. And Lively had to do the same. Now, Lawrence Chatterton had a good marriage. Overall had a bad marriage. Boyce's marriage was probably not the best. He was just so dedicated to his studies. It probably was not the best of marriages, nor was he the best of fathers. Here are some particular peculiars of his at various times in his life that I've picked up from reading about this man. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. Just some odd peculiarities about John Boyce. Basically things that concern his fastidiousness or his meticulous manners. First of all, he had the practice of eating only twice a day, which was a custom in older times much more than it is today, as we'll see from later studies of the Jewish people. He ate lunch and supper. Skip what the nutritionists tell us today is the most important meal of the day, and I would not dispute that, which is breakfast. But he skipped breakfast, eating only lunch and supper. A second, these aren't necessarily, things that are odd or something wrong with him, just things that I thought were interesting about the man John Boyce. Secondly, he either sat or walked 1 hour after eating before going back to study. I guess sometimes if he didn't feel like walking, he just sat. And when he did feel like walking, he walked for exercise and to keep himself from falling into drowsiness, which often happens right after a person eats and then sits down and tries to concentrate on something. You probably found that doesn't work very well. And being one who loved to study, and I guess he felt had to study so much, he had to find a way around that, had to find a way to conquer that. So the thing to do was to get up and move around or just sit there and doze a little bit for an hour and then come to your senses again once your body has had time to digest the food. It's just a fact that your body finds it rather difficult to be digesting the food and also giving you mental abilities to go into some deeper studies. And he saw that those things were contradictory. And so you have to choose one. You either skip eating and stay studying, or eat and then rest afterwards so you can study after that. Thirdly, still speaking about his eating habits, I guess, he was obsessed with carefully cleaning and picking his teeth after every meal. So much so that one author said he went to his grave with a full Hebrew alphabet of teeth. You know how some of the Hebrew characters are shaped, very rigid, back and forth. None of this grinding business of his teeth being all worn down. He was obsessed with carefully cleaning his teeth after every meal, cleaning and picking them. I guess that's what he did that hour after he finished eating. Picked his teeth so he could go back to studying. Fourthly, a very interesting habit that I've even experimented with. It seems to help. He studied only while either standing or kneeling, not sitting. Seems like when you spend as much time as professional students like boys spend studying, and you're sitting there and you seem like all the weight of everything is just crushing down on your abdomen or something, and it just doesn't seem like you can concentrate as well. So he found it necessary to have a platform that was, about this height, so he could just stand, lean on it or whatever, but stand and do a lot of his reading. When he got tired standing, then he'd just kneel down. When he got tired kneeling, then he'd rise back up and stand again. But he never sat whenever he studied. I've practiced that, experimented some with that, even recently, and it seems to work very well. You probably don't have enough time to worry about it. You just study whenever you can. But if you study a lot, that seems to be a good way to do it. Stand up or kneel and study. See, he had some interesting things about him that you can learn from him. I've tried to find these different little things out about these men for your benefit. Number 5, he never studied in a window draft. He never studied in a window draft. He kept away from windows. Buildings were difficult to heat in those days, if not impossible. So he'd certainly stay away from windows. Find a place in the stacks of the library somewhere and do his standing there. And finally, he never went to bed with cold feet. He was a very meticulous, fastidious person. Now, I don't know how a man can go to bed with cold feet. He'd have to be a sissy, I guess. Men are supposed to go to bed with a warm body, and it warms up 100 degrees under the covers. But if your wife is like mine, well, you didn't let me finish that sentence either. Well, it suffocates romance when your wife comes to bed with your husband's duck hunting socks on, dressed out like a polar bear. That seems to be just something that's typical of women. We're hardly in bed, and the light's back on. Where's the socks? Where's the socks? Scrounging through the drawers to find the biggest, thickest, hairiest, wooliest type sock to keep herself warm. And most men don't even sleep, you know, and, well, they used to sleep in old pajamas or something, but most men would suffocate in a pair of light cotton pajamas. But it's true, if you go to bed with cold feet, it's almost impossible to go to sleep. I'm aware of that, because a few times my feet have been cold, I had to find a way to get mine warm as well. I won't tell you how I did it, but I had to find a way to get mine warm. So I can sympathize with the women. You just can't go to sleep if your feet are numb down there like ice cubes. So I always tell her to get them warm before you decide to go to bed. It's too late then, because then it takes 30 minutes to warm them up. Standing in a tub of hot water is the quickest way to warm them up. And then jump in bed before they have time to get cold. So he had learned this, never to go to bed with cold feet. That's something that you should learn if you haven't learned already. Don't wear your husband's duck hunting socks to bed. People wonder what's wrong with marriages, you know, in America. When the woman goes to bed with about a 1/4 inch of cold cream packed on her face and duck hunting socks, well, no wonder there's no romance anymore. It's all gone. Curlers in her hair and 1920s slippers that dogs have been gnawing on around the house. The ugliest thing you could imagine when you see her in bed. Now, my wife isn't like that. Just with the socks and some of the other clothes, but no dog-torn slippers, though, and no cold cream. But you know how women are. The typical woman with curlers in her hair and a sack over her head and cold cream on her face and duck hunting socks on. And they're always the ugliest slippers you can imagine. That old Rufus the Hound has been chewing on, you know. And she slips those on. She's attached to it like a sucking child to their blanket or something. That's what she feels she has to wear. And men are always their best then. They don't have any of that excess on them. Well, it's giving you some help for your marriage. We through with all of that?
I don't know.
We'll find out tonight whether you're through with all of that. I guess you're laughing because you identify with me. Your wife probably does the same thing, scrounging around looking for those old hunting socks of yours. If you're not a hunter, well, she'll have to, I guess, find some of us men who are hunters and borrow our socks in. She can find an old pair of dirty, scroungy, athletic socks probably to wear. Boyce also was one of the men who helped Seville with his 8 volumes on Chrysostom. Now he dies at 83, but we'll see much more of him later when we look at the revision committee, because he is on the 12-man member team of the revisers. So we'll see a lot more about him later. You don't have to worry about forgetting his name, because it'll pop back up and I'll remind you of him again. John Boyce, the only really important man on the whole Cambridge group here, of all of these different men. Okay, number 2. And by the way, remember that Boyce worked on the Apocrypha. What's interesting is that he was an Apocrypha figure, worked on the Apocrypha, but he played such a major role on the revision committee that mostly was concerned with the Old and with the New Testaments. So he somehow worked his way in there, probably because he was worthy of it, of his abilities. But he did the part of the Bible that is least necessary, and even felt so by the KJV translators themselves, the Apocrypha being that part of the Bible least necessary. We would wish they would not expend the mind and the talents of a man so eminent as John Boyce on such a worthless part of the Bible, the Apocrypha. He would have been better to work on the Old or the New Testament. But he didn't. But we'll see him again with the revision committee. Number 2, William Braithwaite. Braithwaite. Little known about him. Doctor, Master of Caius College. C-A-I-U-S. Master of Caius College. C-A-I-U-S. Number 3, Andrew Downes. Andrew Downes. D-O-W-N-E-S. He's the one I got confused earlier when I was talking about Lancelot Andrews. Last name, first name, two entirely different people. He was born in 1549. He died in 1628. 55, the time of the translation. Mr. Fellow at St. John's College. He had been an instructor of John Boyce, had been one of his earlier teachers, his undergraduate days at Cambridge. A very excellent scholar in Greek, necessary for the translation of the Apocrypha, of course, and was one of the 2 men, including Boyce, who helped Seville with his works of Chrysostom. Seville, it was his work, his money, but Boyce and Downes helped him in his editing in 8 volumes of the works of Chrysostom. We mentioned Mr. Downes earlier, many weeks ago, as the only man to get paid for his work on the KJV. Remember how he got paid? He wrote and asked for it. The king paid him. The only man to get paid for his work, working on the KJV. Not talking about the revision committee. They all got paid. The men who met in Stationers Hall, they were all paid. So much per man per week. But Andrew Downes is the only man to be paid for his actual translation work, not revising work. But he also was an important member of the final revision committee. So we've seen several of these Apocrypha translators that will end up on the revision committee, which will have say-so over the whole of the Bible, not just the Apocrypha, not just the Greek parts of the Bible, the whole of the Bible, including the Hebrew Old Testament. Number 4, John Duport. John Duport. D-U-P-O-R-T. Doctor, Master of Jesus College. Had a good wife and a very good marriage. And he was chairman of the Apocrypha group. John Duport. Not Boyce, but Duport. Chairman of the Apocrypha group. With a good wife and a good marriage. Number 5, Jeremy Radcliffe. Jeremy Radcliffe. Radcliffe. Doctor, fellow at Trinity College. Number 6, Samuel Ward. Samuel Ward, born in 1577. Don't know when he died. He has the distinction of being the youngest member on the KJV committee. He was 27. He was 27. Fellow at Trinity College. He was a Puritan, but not strongly so. Certainly not dogmatic in his beliefs or his church leaning. He's also known not only as the youngest of the translators at 27, but he's known for the diary, which is still extant, in which he is always chastening himself for some of the silliest sins. And I have part of his diary here to read. It's always like one of the earlier translators who always was remorse because of his earlier state of sinfulness and the fact that he enjoyed it. And so he talked about the burden of a loaden conscience. Well, Ward was not so much looking back on unconverted years and being sorry for that, but over last night's or yesterday's sins and being sorry for those. Let me read some of his diary. May the 13th, 1595. In his diary, he condemned himself for my desire of preferment over much. It gets better as I go along. Often he addressed himself in the second person. Thus, that same day, May the 13th, 1595, he wrote, "Thy wandering regard in the chapel at prayer time is an abomination." May the 17th, "My gluttony the night before was sin." May 23rd, "My sleeping without remembering my last thought, which should have been God, was wrong." May the 26th. This month of May was a bad one for him. "Thy dullness this day in hearing God's word, thy sin of pride, thy thoughts at prayer time same evening." June the 14th. "My negligence in sleeping immediately after dinner, in hearing another sermon sluggishly." June the 12th. "My too much drinking after supper." June the 22nd. "My immoderate diet of eating cheese." June the 27th. "My going to drink wine, and that in the tavern before I called upon my God." I like this one. July the 8th. "My immoderate laughter in the hall." But that was sin, immoderate. He just burst out laughing about something and was convicted about that. July the 15th, "My incontinent thoughts at Hobson's." Then the next year, July of the next year, the 19th, and this is a phrase or thing similar to this, a sin that he felt was the worst of sins that you find over and over and over again in his diary. You can tell what he liked to eat. "My gluttony in eating plums and raisins, and drinking so much after supper." July the 23rd, "I rebuked myself for eating so many plums." You imagine a man so concerned that he'd eat too many plums the day before that surely he had fallen out of God's good pleasure. "My eating so many plums, although thou heard that many died of surfeits." You've heard of surfeiting as overindulgence. He said that he had heard of people who died of eating of too many plums, and he was concerned about that. August the 6th, "My longing after damsons," which is an Asiatic plum. "My longing after damsons," plums, "when I made my vow to my God not to eat while I walked through the orchard." You can imagine this poor young man walking through the orchard, and it's just like demons hanging on trees all around him. He's so tempted to taste those juicy plums there, and as soon as he picked one and ate it, then his conscience was stricken, and he smote his breast by writing in his diary about that. August the 13th, my intemperate eating of damsons. Also my intemperate eating of cheese after supper. August the 21st, my long sleeping in the morning. Slept too long that day. Then this writer of him has this to say: as an eater of damson plums and cheese, dear Samuel Ward may endear himself to many of us, as well as for his sluggish hearing of sermons. This young would-be divine was human and loving without really having any mortal sins. If those were his only sins, he was a saint in my book. Eating too many plums is all he was. Notice he doesn't say anything about, well, he mentioned pride there one time, but he doesn't hardly mention any serious sins. It's just that he ate too many plums and too much cheese. And then, finally, number 7, Robert Ward, not related to Samuel Ward. Robert Ward, Mr. Fellow at King's College. Now that wraps up those men. 53 men total that I've given you thus far, which means we're lacking 4. Well, in addition to all of these men, we have 3 stray ones that we just don't know where to fit them in. We know they did something, but we don't know what they did. That is, we don't know which committee they worked on. So kind of put this as a footnote now under them all as the 3 stray men. Number 1, William Eyre. E-Y-R-E. William Eyre. We know nothing about him except that in December of 1608, he wrote a letter to James Ussher in Dublin, Ireland, asking that Ussher please return some work loaned to him. Now, the only reason I mention this is, well, really 2 reasons. There are 2 reasons I mention this. One is this is all we know about him, the only reference we have to the man. And 2, do you know who James Ussher, do you remember, I should say, who James Ussher is? An archbishop. He's the one who worked out the chronology of creation dating to 4004 BC. He's the one who did that. James Ussher, who ended up as an archbishop in Dublin, Ireland, an Irish archbishop. He's the one who gave us the 4004 BC dating system for Genesis chapter 1. So he's living right around the same time. It has nothing to do with the KJV, as far as the translating, and he's not trying to think up some dates to put in there. His dates end up attached to the Bible in some editions much, much later. Now, in this letter, dated December of 1608, in which he primarily is asking for some loaned work, that it be returned to him, he mentioned just in passing that he was very busy right now working on a translation of the English Bible. That's how we know he was on the committee. Some committee. We don't know which of the 3 places or 6 groups. But he just mentions in passing that he's extremely busy now because he's working on the translation of a new English Bible. A second stray man, Thomas Spark. End his last name with an E. Thomas Spark. You remember him from earlier? Probably not. Okay, one of the 4 Puritans at Hampton Court. Not a very important one, but one of the 4 Puritans at Hampton Court before King James, the early months of 1604. Reynolds was the important one, the father of the KJV. And Chatterton was an important one, and Spark was one not very important. There were 2 important ones, which we've already discussed, 2 unimportant ones. We gave you their names in. We said one of them will later work as a translator, and one of them will not. So the other man, we don't need to remember. Thomas Spark, not much we have on him, except that he was there at Hampton Court Conference, one of the 4 Puritans chosen to stand before the 50 Anglicans, and a man who also worked on the actual translation itself. And then finally, number 3, Arthur Lake, L-A-K-E. He seems to have been born around 1559, which would put him in his mid-40s, 45 when he worked on the KJV. He seems to be born. around 1559. On April the 18th of 1608, right in the middle of the actual work on the KJV, April the 18th, 1608, he's made Dean of Winchester. He was a brother to the King's secretary, James's personal secretary. And he may have been, although we're not for sure, may have been on the final revision committee. Now you count all those names up, that's 56. We're still lacking one. Remember who we're missing that we haven't discussed yet? Thomas Bilson, one of the two final editors. He, along with Miles Smith, are the two final editors. We said that one of the final editors did work on the KJV. The actual translation one did not. Miles Smith did. Thomas Bilson did not. He was born in 1547. So he's not so much one of these three stray ones. He's just one final one under all of the other names you have. He was born in 1547, which would make him 57, the time of the work. He took his D.D. degree in 1581. Made Bishop of Winchester, 1597. As I've said, was one of the final two editors. But unlike Miles Smith, he was not also a translator. And he was somewhat of a poet. And he may have been hired on as a stylist. Being a poet, he would probably be good at that. Now, I also think I said that in a recent message. It's amazing how much we say up here just in passing, and we come back to it somewhere later and use it. That all good Bibles, especially, or most notably in modern times, the NIV, hires professional stylists. People who have no training in biblical studies. They may be an atheist, but they're perfectionists when it comes to English writing and English grammar. And I know one of the stylists because she lives right, it was a woman who lives right down near Gordon Conwell, who was one of the chief stylists to work on the NIV. And generally they're like college professors of English or something. They're just very excellent. And they know how, they might not know Greek or Hebrew, but they know English. The translators know Greek and Hebrew, and they may not know English. So they can translate into English for you, but the stylist can help make things read well and read smoothly. And being a poet, Bilson may have been used for that. And when you need those people is not back at the very beginning during the translation, but at the very end to smooth out all of the rough defects of the translation. So my guess would be that's probably why Bilson was stuck in. Miles Smith could be used as a stylist as well, but he was very, very knowledgeable in Greek and Hebrew, one of the most learned men of his day. So it would only make sense that Smith would also be a translator and not just a final editor. So, surprise of surprises, we're through with the Men Behind the KJV, or almost, not quite through. We're through giving you their names. There are all the names of all the men who had anything to do with official work on the KJV. These, in other words, these are the men who gave us the world's most famous book. And we probably don't have enough time left on this globe for another book to surpass this. The world's most famous book, in anyone's estimation, is the King James Version of the English Bible. And these are the men who gave us the world's most famous book. And notice that probably in your understanding and your knowledge, most of these men are not very famous. You probably hadn't even heard of any of them. It certainly was not like a William Shakespeare or a Francis Bacon or someone like that who worked on this. Men who were leading scholars of their day, but who have not passed into history on the same scale as someone like a Calvin or a Luther and so forth.
Are these translators considered scholars, or could you call them theologians?
Well, essentially the same.
Same thing?
Essentially the same. Sometimes scholar is used because the person is, they have degrees in what we call biblical studies, and that really means Hebrew and Greek and the study of the book itself, like a commentator on Genesis or on Ecclesiastes, whereas a theologian is closer to a philosopher. He just deals, he pretty much has to know Greek and Hebrew, but it's not nearly as necessary as someone who's going to actually do a word-by-word study in a commentary on some book. He has to deal with a lot of abstractions and put a whole theological system together. So some were more theologian than scholar, some more scholar than theologian, and some more ecclesiastical church leader, bishop, archbishop, or something like that, than either scholar or theologian. But they were all good enough at what they did to have served well on the committee. I want to say a few things. That's a good question because it brings me to my next paragraph here. Just a few things in summing some of this up. There were no Roman Catholics. There were no Jews. There were no women. Looking at these men, there were no Roman Catholic, Jews, or women who had anything to do with this work. That's just the way they chose to work then. No Roman Catholics or Jews or women. So, well, that just makes sense. Well, not necessarily in light of what some people are doing today, because the Roman Catholics and Protestants get together today. There's more of the, ecumenical spirit than there was back in those days. There was a terrible time to get together in those days for Catholic scholars and Protestant scholars to get together and work on a translation. And that's been done. Not in this day. Not women, because that wasn't their role, and not Jews, because most of the Christians who came out of the Reformation, I don't know whether you know this or not, but had horribly anti-Semitic views toward the Jewish people. Luther persecuted them and tried to run them out of the country of Germany, and Calvin hated the Jews and so forth. They had very deeply ingrained anti-Semitic views, so they would certainly not allow a Jew to work with them. And I think you can run along, and with the exception of a few of the foreign-born men, you can look at their last names and see that most of these are Englishmen. They have English names. Some were young, some were old. I'm trying to give you a bird's eye view now of what we've done minutely. Some Puritan, some Anglican. Some virtuous, probably like Samuel Ward, even though he ate too many plums. And some not so virtuous, like the drunken Dutchman. Some married and some single, but all highly educated and highly competent. There seemed to be a lot of diversity as far as personal background or church affiliation, marriage background, and so forth. Seemed to be a lot of differentiation, but there was uniformity in the fact they were all highly educated and highly competent to do this work. And that's good to know. These were not numbskulls chosen to work on the KJV. These were extremely intelligent men. And we're talking about a John Reynolds or Lancelot Andrews. We're talking about two of the most educated men in the entire world of that day. And I mean educated, as you know about Andrews, just learning every language and reading every book that he could find, educated about all matters, not just theological matters. That would be hard to find today. With all of the specialists, we have to name the most intelligent person in the whole world. That's hard to do. You go back a few centuries and you could pick out a handful of men who were the brightest men on the globe. And of course it's well nigh impossible to do that today. So I did want you to know that and to let that sink in, that these men are not numbskulls. They're not theological numbskulls. They're not novices. They are highly educated men. Some of them scholar theologians, some of them church leaders, but even the church leaders had gone through the motions of receiving their educational degrees. Although not all of them were Mr., you notice that almost all of them were readers or lecturers or professors or fellows or something at a university. Some were deacons and bishops and so forth, but most of them, if not all of them, did teach or had taught at university or graduate level somewhere in their life. Most lived in South England, which is where London is, so they could easily get to and from home as well as to and from these three different centers. Those far away, such as William Barlow, would probably come to one of the three places for the week and then go back home on the weekend. Obviously, he wouldn't be a teacher or something somewhere around there. he's got to get back home and probably have something to do with his church. It was part-time work. It was no pay work. They just received room and board. Another final concern here is the numbers game. Remember when I gave you this whole list of how many were originally chosen, and then some died and they had to be replaced, and then the British Museum's list gives so many numbers and another. Well, let's go through this number crunching game one more time and we'll be through with this. One thing that most people want to know is who were the 54 original men? We know we end up with 57. And we know that those 57 aren't the 54 plus 3. Because of the 54, 7 of them died or moved away. Who were the original 54 men? Well, it could not have been any of the known replacements, because they were a replacement, not an original one. The 3 known replacements were John Aglionby, Leonard Hutton, and Robert Spalding. I gave you this with each of their 3 names. John Aglionby, Leonard Hutton, and Robert Spalding. Those are the 3 known replacements. So they could not be a part of the 54 original. But once we go beyond that, it's impossible to say who were the original 54 men. We know that as we worked along, let me just jot this down for you. This is what we end up with. Westminster, let me do Oxford, the Cambridge. Westminster, we had 10 old, 7 new. Oxford, we had 7 new plus a stray one. 7 old plus a stray one, 8 new plus a stray one. And then Cambridge, we had 8 old, 7 apocrypha. Then we had the 3 stray ones I gave you. Then we had Thomas Bilson. And so you add all of this up as we go along here. And that's how we end up with our final number of 57. To show you in one schematic here. Westminster had 10 and 7. Oxford had 7, then 1 stray one that seems to have worked with Old Testament. 8 new and a stray one. Cambridge 8 and 7, no strays, and then 3 strays at the end that we don't know where to put them, and then Thomas Bilson, the last one. And that should total up to our 57 men. Now, with the time I have left, let me just give you a few other things in another area. We've been talking about all the men down to 1611 who have had something to do with the KJV. What I would like to do next is take you through the years 1604 to 1611, which really serve as the framework for the translation, and tell you a little of what's going on during those years, from 1604 to 1611. In short, we could say that the work was characterized by interruptions. It was a part-time, no-pay job that was often interrupted. You have to visualize it as a very long, drawn-out, part-time, no-pay project where the translators continued as best as possible with their regular lives. Some, of course, would obviously get into the translating process more fervently than would others, but most of them would try to keep up as regular as possible with their ordinary lives. But as I say, it's characterized by interruptions. Let me give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interruptions. Some more important than others and some longer lasting than others by their nature. Some of the interruptions. What's going on during this period from 1604 to 1611, both in England as well as in the homes of these men? First of all, I would just mention daily lives. That would be a huge interruption in their work. The interruption of their normal existence. Not that the KJV is now imposing on them the work required and is interrupting their daily life, although that happens, but rather the reverse. They have an ordinary, regular life to maintain, and that often interrupts their work on the KJV. For instance, think if the man gets sick, or his wife gets sick, or his child is killed. He's not going to run off and translate that day or week, so they'd cut out a whole week or day or month of his time or whatever. I've said that almost all of these men are ecclesiastical or educational leaders of one sort or another. So their church-related or school-related responsibilities also would hinder them. When it's test time and they have papers to grade, or when it's dissertation time and they have to sit and examine some doctoral candidate or whatever, that's going to take a lot of time out of their KJV work. A few of them are married with children. Others probably had to have additional jobs to help pay and make ends meet. So regardless of whether we're talking about professors or deans or fellows or pastors or bishops or archbishops or deacons or readers or lecturers or whatever, they had an ordinary life that had to be maintained. So this was not a 365-day-a-year type of job. It was a part-time, no pay, often interrupted job. Secondly, death was also an interruption. I didn't really mean that to be such an understatement. I didn't mean an interruption for the fellow who died. Obviously, it was a perpetual, permanent one for him. But that would also interrupt the work of others. The attending of the funeral, the preaching of the sermon. Here are the men who died during the work of the KJV, in chronological order. Number 1, Richard Edis. He worked on Cambridge Old Testament. He died November the 19th, 1604. So that's very early in the preliminary work. They don't officially start until 1607. Edward Lively, Oxford New Testament. He died in May of 1605. Ralph Hutchinson, Westminster New Testament. He died early 1606. Most sadly of all, John Reynolds, Oxford Old Testament. Died in 1607, the father of the KJV. Never saw its completion. Never saw it really begin. Doesn't start until the year he dies. And finally, Thomas Ravis, Oxford New Testament. December the 14th, 1609. So it's Milton's steady march of death, of these men dying from whenever they began the work in 1604, almost to the very end, late 1609. The work has already been through by this time, and now it's before the committee. So those are the 5 men that we know that died from 1604 to 1611 while working on the KJV. So there'd be sermons, as I say, to preach, burials and so forth, condolences to grieving surviving relatives and so forth. So death was a very obvious interruption in these men's lives. Thirdly, we have the pompous travels of King James, the king's travels. For instance, a royal visit, which was rather rare, was paid to Oxford commencing on August the 27th, 1605. August the 27th, 1605, which was a huge, pompous state affair that had to have affected all of the translators living there who had begun the preliminary work on the Bible. And it lasted for several weeks. So they would have to suspend their translating activities to be with the king, enjoy the king's travel in their midst. That's one example. He traveled to the other places as well, and whenever he did, that would pretty much stop the work. The fourth place, another interruption, was the gunpowder plot. 8 messages ago or so, we looked at this event of November 1605 and how it occupied all the minds of the people in England. As I said before, the Roman Catholics had shown their hand, and the English people did not like what they saw. So that had to interrupt a lot of work. And along with the gunpowder plot itself, all of the trials and the hangings of the men that we've talked about as we've gone along with these men, and who preached sermons and who stopped translating to go watch whose neck broken or sliced, their head cut off or whatever. So that has to involve interruption. The fifth place, the weather would often involve interruption. It'd be very difficult in the wintertime, if you live very far away, to get there. And I might also add, recall the scenario of the Hampton Court Conference, of the not washing of the hands and the perfume in the air and the dipping in balms and oils. These castles and schools and universities and libraries where this work was done were not places easily heated. It'd be very, very cold there during the wintertime and very difficult to work. And if, in the midst of all of that, you had an unusually cold winter come along, then it could pretty much mean disaster for people of that day. You have nothing but a huge castle or a huge library or a huge university with a stone fireplace in a couple of corners, and that's all you have for heat. Fireplace is nice and great and warm as long as you're in front of it. But when the hall there measures 100 yards by 50 yards, a fireplace doesn't do very much good there, and the ceilings are 40 feet high. You'll have to be right in front of it. And so will all the other 500 people in that room. They'll also want to be right in front of it. So if you've got an unusually cold winter, you're in trouble. Did we have any from 1604 to 1611? Yes, we did. London experienced a terrific winter, the 1607-1608 winter. Now, London is not a place known for being that cold. The sun never shines there, but it's not known for being that cold. But temperatures were sent down to 0 this winter and stayed there for several weeks. That's remarkable even right here in Vermont. I mean, if temperatures go down to 0 and stay there for 14, 21 days, that's amazing. For London, it's doubly amazing. The Thames River froze over solid, not all the way to the bottom, but solid so you can walk on it, which is not something that happens every day in London. The Thames River froze over. It's like snowing in Bethlehem or snowing in Jerusalem. It does, but it's not something that happens every year. It's like snowing in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It happens every 5 years, or, well, for Jerusalem, not even that often. There's a verse over in the end of Psalms. I wonder if they were working on this whenever that cold spell hit. Psalm 147:17, he casts forth his eyes like morsels, and who can stand before his cold? Psalm 147:17. Surely they had to think of that in this winter of 07 to 08. So that would have been a big interruption. Everything would shut down for a few weeks. And then finally, the regular promotions. People are always looking for a way to climb up the church ladder. And we have pointed out in looking at each man that some of them at different times from 4 to 11 were promoted to new positions in the church or in the schools.